A police officer and his loyal German shepherd were patrolling the snowy streets of Denver when they saw her. A little girl curled up on a park bench, clutching a ragged teddy bear as the winter wind cut through her thin coat. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Please don't let them take me." Those words pierced the officer's heart like nothing else. What he uncovered that night would expose a dark family secret, test his faith, and lead to a miracle no one expected. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe every child deserves love and protection, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will restore your faith in family, hope, and second chances. The city of Denver lay beneath a heavy curtain of snow, each flake drifting slowly under the pale glow of the street lamps. Winter had tightened its grip on Colorado, and the streets bore the silence of a city muffled in ice. The tall buildings of downtown rose like silent sentinels, their glass facades reflecting the faint shimmer of Christmas lights that clung stubbornly to storefronts. The usual hum of traffic was hushed, only the crunch of boots on packed snow and the occasional whir of a snowplow disturbed the stillness. On such a night, the people of Denver hurried home, eager to escape the cold, but not everyone had a warm place waiting for them. Lucas Bennett, 41 years old, moved steadily along the edge of Civic Center Park, his breath fogging in the icy air. Lucas was a police officer in the Denver Police Department, tall and broad-shouldered, with short dark hair that bore the first hints of silver at his temples. His hazel eyes carried the weight of years spent staring into human suffering eyes that once held warmth but had grown more cautious with time. He wore his Navy patrol jacket zipped to his throat, though the chill seemed to pierce even the thick fabric. Lucas was known among his colleagues for his relentless dedication. He was the kind of man who didn't walk away from a case even when off duty. Yet beneath his stern exterior was a scar no badge could conceal: the loss of his wife and young daughter years earlier in a car accident. The grief had reshaped him, made him wary of attachment, hesitant to open his heart, and yet fiercely protective of those who could not defend themselves. Walking at his side was Rocky, a German shepherd of 7 years, his thick coat a striking mix of black and tan. Rocky had once served as a K9 search and rescue dog, and though he had been retired after an injury to his hind leg, his spirit remained sharp, his amber eyes alert. He bore a simple leather harness with faded insignia, a reminder of his service days. Rocky's frame was powerful, muscles rippling beneath his fur, but his demeanor was gentle with those in need, instinctively protective. To Lucas, Rocky was more than a dog. He was both partner and family, a loyal soul who had pulled him through dark nights when grief threatened to consume him. They shared an unspoken understanding forged from countless patrols and lonely evenings, both survivors clinging to each other. The snow crunched beneath their boots and paws as they entered the park. Civic Center Park, usually a gathering place for families in the summer, now lay deserted, the benches covered in frost, the fountains frozen solid. The trees stood like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky, each branch heavy with ice. Lucas scanned the area with the practiced eye of a patrolman. Though off-duty, he carried the same vigilance as if on shift, his hand resting lightly near his utility belt. Rocky sniffed the air, ears pricking forward. It was then that Lucas heard it, a faint sound, barely audible above the whisper of wind. A cry, thin and fragile, almost carried away by the storm. He froze, his breath hanging in the air, and tilted his head. Rocky's ears perked sharply, and the dog gave a low whine before tugging the leash toward the north end of the park. Lucas followed, his heartbeat quickening. On a snow-covered bench beneath a flickering lamppost sat a little girl, curled into herself like a wounded bird. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her light brown hair was tangled and fell in uneven strands around her pale face, which was pinched with cold. She wore a threadbare coat at least 2 sizes too small, the sleeves barely covering her thin arms, and her jeans were torn at the knees. Her shoes were worn nearly to the sole, one lace missing, and her hands clutched a faded backpack as if it were her only shield against the world. Her lips were tinged blue, trembling with each shallow breath, and her large eyes darted toward Lucas and Rocky with the frightened suspicion of a child who had been taught not to trust. Lucas's chest tightened at the sight. This was Sophie Turner, though he did not yet know her name. The girl looked as though she had stepped out of one of his nightmares, small, frail, abandoned, left to battle the cold alone. He crouched slowly, lowering himself to her level, his knees sinking into the snow. "Hey, sweetheart," Lucas said softly, his voice carrying the gentleness he reserved for the most fragile victims. "It's freezing out here. What are you doing all alone?" The girl flinched, pulling the backpack tighter against her chest. She whispered, so faintly he almost didn't catch it. Don't tell anyone. Aunt Monica said, I can't ask for help." The words cut deeper than the cold. Lucas's brow furrowed, rage and sorrow mingling inside him. He reached slowly for his patrol jacket and shrugged it off despite the biting wind, draping it carefully around the girl's shoulders. She stiffened at first, but the warmth made her exhale a shuddering breath. Rocky, sensing the tension, stepped forward with quiet grace. He lowered himself onto the snow before her, tilting his great head so that his amber eyes met hers. For a moment, Sophie seemed torn between fear and wonder. Then, almost instinctively, her small hand reached out, brushing the thick fur of his neck. Rocky leaned closer, nuzzling gently into her touch, and a tiny smile flickered across the girl's lips. It was faint, but it was the first sign of light breaking through the fog of her fear. Lucas watched the interaction, his heart aching. He saw in her eyes not only fear but the faint reflection of his daughter, the one he had lost. He forced himself to focus, to stay grounded in the present. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting toward the shadows of the park, as if afraid someone might overhear. At last, she murmured, "Sophie." Lucas repeated it gently, as though anchoring her to the world. "Sophie. That's a beautiful name. You don't have to be afraid anymore, okay? You're safe with me. And with Rocky." Sophie's gaze flicked to Rocky again, her tiny fingers curling into his fur. The dog stayed still, his steady warmth radiating through her frostbitten hands. The snow swirled harder around them, flakes catching in the lamplight like shards of glass. Lucas felt the chill burrow into his bones, but he didn't move. He knew that walking away was not an option. He'd been trained to handle criminals, to face danger, to chase shadows through alleys. But nothing had ever prepared him for the quiet devastation of a child left in the cold by the very people meant to protect her. He extended his hand slowly, palm up, leaving the choice to her. Sophie looked at it, hesitated, then slipped her small, trembling fingers into his. The trust was fragile, but it was real. "Come on," Lucas murmured. "Let's get you somewhere warm." With that, he lifted her gently into his arms. Sophie clutched the backpack tightly, as though it carried the last pieces of her world. Rocky circled protectively at Lucas's side, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows as if daring the night to try and harm the child again. As Lucas walked through the snow, the city around him seemed to fade. The only thing that mattered now was the small life trembling in his arms. He didn't know yet how deep the darkness around her ran, or how dangerous the truth about her family might prove. All he knew was that tonight, on this frozen bench in Denver, he had found someone worth protecting again. The drive through Denver's icy streets was slow, headlights slicing through the heavy snow as Lucas steered his patrol SUV with one hand, the other arm wrapped securely around the child nestled beside him. Sophie clung to her faded backpack as if it contained her very heartbeat. Rocky sat in the back seat, his amber eyes alert, ears twitching with every passing sound outside. The heater hummed, filling the vehicle with a fragile warmth that seemed to thaw the edges of Sophie's trembling frame. Lucas glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. Her eyes, large and shadowed, shifted constantly between him and the passing blur of streetlights. He could see the conflict inside her, the desire to trust, strangled by fear planted deep by someone she should have been able to rely on. By the time they reached Capitol Hill, the streets had quieted into the hush that only deep night and snow could bring. Lucas parked in front of his building, a tall brick structure with narrow balconies dusted in white. The lobby lights glowed faintly, casting golden reflections onto the slick sidewalk. He scooped Sophie into his arms again despite her soft protest, the child too light for her age, a living testament to neglect. Rocky padded close, his paws leaving neat prints in the snow as he followed them inside. The lobby doors opened, and warmth rushed to meet them. Behind the front desk sat Eleanor White, the building manager, who had lived there nearly 20 years. Eleanor was 55, short and stout, with sharp cheekbones softened by years of laughter lines. Her gray-streaked hair was tied back in a no-nonsense bun, and her glasses hung from a chain around her neck. She wore a thick wool cardigan and carried herself with the brisk efficiency of someone who ran her building like a ship's captain. Beneath her sternness, however, lay a heart bruised by her own history. She had lost her son to addiction a decade earlier, and that grief had hardened her on the outside while deepening her compassion for the vulnerable. When she looked up and saw Lucas carrying a child wrapped in his police jacket, her eyes widened. "Good Lord, Lucas," she exclaimed, her voice a mix of worry and reprimand. "Who's this?" Lucas lowered Sophie gently to the floor. She clutched the backpack tighter, half hiding behind his leg as Rocky pressed in protectively. "Her name's Sophie," Lucas replied quietly. "Found her alone in Civic Center Park. Could have frozen to death if Rocky hadn't hurt her." Eleanor stepped closer, lowering herself to the girl's level. Her movements softened, her stern face melting into concern. She reached for Sophie's hand, and when the sleeve of the jacket slipped back, she froze. Purple bruises ringed the child's thin wrist, deliberate marks too uniform to be accidental. Eleanor's lips pressed into a hard line. "Lucas," she whispered sharply, "these aren't from the cold." Sophie instinctively yanked her hand back, retreating behind Lucas. He knelt beside her, his voice low and steady. "It's all right, Sophie. You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." The girl's eyes glistened, tears pooling at the edges, but she nodded faintly. For the first time, she allowed herself to stand in the light of the lobby instead of hiding in the shadows. Rocky brushed against her side, anchoring her. Lucas exchanged a grim look with Eleanor. He knew what she wanted him to do: call it in, file the report, set the system in motion. But after years on the force, Lucas also knew how slow and tangled the system could be, how easily children slipped through cracks. His own grief whispered caution. He remembered sterile hospital corridors, signatures on forms that had ended his daughter's life support, and the helplessness that followed. He would not let Sophie be swallowed by bureaucracy tonight. "Let me get her upstairs first," Lucas murmured. Eleanor gave a tight nod, though her eyes said clearly, "This isn't over." They rode the elevator to the top floor. Sophie's small hand gripped the railing as if the ground might vanish beneath her feet. The apartment door opened into a spacious loft with tall windows overlooking Denver's snow-laden streets. Yet despite its size, the space felt hollow, the kind of home that belonged to a man who spent more time on duty than within its walls. Sparse furniture, shelves lined with untouched books, and a faint smell of polish greeted them. Sophie hesitated in the doorway, clutching her backpack like armor. Lucas noticed the way her eyes roamed, wide and cautious, as though she expected someone to leap from the shadows. He crouched to meet her gaze. "This is my place. You'll be safe here tonight." Rocky trotted inside first, shaking the snow from his fur, and padded toward a corner rug where his old blanket lay. He glanced back, waiting for Sophie to follow. The girl finally stepped in, her shoes leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor. Eleanor arrived moments later with a tray, 2 mugs of steaming cocoa, and a plate of bread rolls she had apparently snatched from her own kitchen. She placed them on the counter with a cluck of disapproval. "Children need warm food. And answers," she said, glancing at Lucas. Lucas guided Sophie to the couch. She perched on the edge, legs swinging nervously, her backpack never leaving her lap. He slid one of the mugs toward her. The steam fogged her cheeks, and after a hesitant sip, color began to return to her pale face. "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked gently, sitting across from her. Sophie's eyes flickered with pain. Mom's in the hospital. She was in a car crash. She hasn't woken up." Her voice cracked and she bit her lip, fighting tears. Lucas's stomach knotted. "What about your dad?" he asked softly. "Never met him," Sophie whispered. Then, after a long pause, she added, "Aunt Monica says I'm trouble. She sells Mom's things." She said not to tell police. Eleanor inhaled sharply, anger flashing in her eyes. Lucas's jaw clenched. He had suspected neglect, but hearing the words from Sophie's own lips turned suspicion into certainty. Rocky, sensing the tension, placed his massive head in Sophie's lap. She stroked his ears, her trembling calming under his steady warmth. Her eyes softened for the first time, as if Rocky had bridged a gap no human words could cross. Lucas wanted to change the air, to give Sophie a moment of peace. His gaze drifted to the old acoustic guitar leaning against the wall, strings gathering dust. He hadn't touched it in years, not since the night he buried his family. With a sigh, he picked it up and strummed a tentative chord. The sound was clumsy, rusty from neglect, but it carried through the quiet room. Sophie looked up, her eyes widening. "You play?" "Used to," Lucas admitted, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. She slid off the couch, still clutching Rocky's fur with one hand, and stood beside him. "Play more," she urged, her small voice insistent. Lucas hesitated, then tried again. The melody stumbled, but Sophie began humming softly, filling the gaps with her small, sure tune. Rocky gave a low, approving rumble as if he too recognized the fragile magic of the moment. Eleanor, leaning against the kitchen counter, folded her arms and allowed herself the rare indulgence of a smile. For the first time in years, Lucas felt the ice within his chest begin to thaw. It wasn't gone, not yet, but it cracked enough to let in a flicker of warmth. He looked at Sophie, humming with closed eyes, her small shoulders still trembling, but her voice steady. Something inside him whispered that this night had shifted the course of both their lives. The snow outside fell harder, blanketing Denver in silence. Within the apartment, the faint sound of guitar strings mingled with a child's humming and the soft breathing of a loyal dog. For one fragile moment, the world was no longer cruel. It was simply alive with the promise of shelter. Morning crept into Denver with a dull gray light, the snowstorm having left the city blanketed in silence. From the tall windows of Lucas Bennett's loft, the streets below looked like an untouched sheet of paper, broken only by the tire tracks of early commuters. Inside, the apartment was warmer than it had been in years, though its warmth came less from the heater and more from the presence of a small girl curled under a borrowed quilt on the couch. Sophie Turner slept uneasily, her thin frame rising and falling with shallow breaths, her backpack tucked under her head as a makeshift pillow. Beside her, Rocky lay stretched out, his large body curled protectively against the couch as if standing guard. Lucas stood in the kitchen, sipping coffee that had long gone cold, his mind circling like a hawk above troubled ground. He had seen bruises like Sophie's before, too many times in his years as a cop. They weren't accidents, they were warnings carved into skin by someone who knew the child had no defense. He looked at Rocky, who lifted his head and met his gaze with steady amber eyes, as if to say, "Do something." He picked up his phone, scrolling past numbers he hadn't called in years, until he landed on one that made him pause. Marcus Hale. Marcus had been his partner once, a detective with a sharp mind and a reputation for digging too deep. He was 45 now, tall and wiry, with thinning dark blonde hair and pale blue eyes that never seemed to miss a detail. Marcus dressed in rumpled coats that looked perpetually a day away from the dry cleaner, and his voice carried the gravel of too many late nights and too much coffee. He had left the force after a bitter case involving police corruption, disillusioned but unwilling to abandon justice altogether. Now he worked as a private investigator, taking cases others overlooked. He was cynical, blunt, but loyal to the few people he trusted, and Lucas had been one of them. The phone rang twice before Marcus's voice, rough but alert, answered. "Bennett, didn't think I'd hear from you again." Lucas exhaled, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I need your eyes on something. It's not official. It's personal." Marcus was silent for a beat, then replied, "Those are the dangerous ones. Where do you want to meet?" An hour later, Lucas found himself at a diner on Colfax Avenue, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a smell of grease that clung to your clothes. Marcus sat in a corner booth, a battered leather notebook already open in front of him. He looked up, his gaze sharp despite the fatigue etched into the lines of his face. "So," he said without preamble, "what kind of trouble have you dragged home?" Lucas slid into the booth, glancing around before leaning forward. He told him everything. The night patrol through Civic Center Park, the girl freezing on the bench, the bruises on her wrist, the whispered warning about Aunt Monica. He left nothing out, not even the way Rocky had seemed to sense her before he did. Marcus scribbled notes as he listened, his pen scratching across the page. Grace Turner, 33, mother in a coma. Monica Turner, 29, aunt and temporary guardian. Bruises, neglect, and a warning to avoid police. Smells like someone has something to hide. Lucas nodded grimly. And then there's Dylan Cross. Sophie mentioned him by name. Boyfriend of Monica. History of racing and petty crime, the kind who thinks his fists make the rules. Marcus tapped the notebook. If Grace's crash wasn't an accident, then Cross is our man. But the aunt, she's the one with the legal claim, which means she's either blind, complicit, or both. As they talked, Rocky sat by the booth, his head resting on Lucas's thigh. Sophie, too fragile to bring along, had stayed back at the apartment with Eleanor keeping an eye on her. But Lucas couldn't stop thinking about the child curled on his couch, humming in her sleep as though even her dreams weren't safe. Marcus flipped the notebook closed. I'll pull police reports on Grace's accident, hospital logs, and anything on Monica and Cross. If they're dirty, I'll find it. But Lucas, he leaned in, his voice dropping low. You know what happens when you stick your nose in family disputes. The system doesn't always side with the truth. Lucas's jaw tightened. Then we make sure they can't ignore it. Back at the loft, Sophie had woken. She sat cross-legged on the floor with a box of crayons Eleanor had dug out from storage. The colors were worn to stubs, but Sophie handled them with care, sketching shapes onto scrap paper. When Lucas walked in, she lifted one of the papers toward him. It was a drawing of 3 figures under a night sky, a tall man with a square jaw, a large dog with pointed ears, and a small girl holding their hands. Above them, stars shimmered as tiny yellow dots. That's you, Sophie said softly, pointing at the tall figure. Then her eyes shifted, shy but steady. That's Rocky. And that's me. Lucas felt something crack in his chest, fragile and dangerous. He crouched down, running a hand over the drawing. You're a good artist, he said. Sophie shrugged. I used to draw with Mom. She'd play the piano, and I'd draw next to her. But now, Aunt Monica says it's a waste of time. Rocky let out a low growl at the mention of Monica, as though even he understood the harm tied to that name. Lucas ruffled the dog's fur, hiding his own surge of anger. Later that afternoon, Marcus called back with his first findings. Grace's crash report listed it as driver fatigue, but there were inconsistencies. The impact was to the rear quarter panel, consistent with being forced off the road. No skid marks. No attempt to brake, almost like the car had been nudged deliberately. And worse, there had been mention of a second vehicle, but that detail had been buried in the report's fine print. Somebody wanted her out of the picture, Marcus said grimly over the phone. And Dylan Cross's name shows up in 2 unrelated traffic incidents last year, both swept under the rug. He's dirty, Lucas. Real dirty. Lucas looked across the room at Sophie, who sat on the couch with Rocky's head in her lap, humming softly as she braided a bit of the dog's fur. His throat tightened. She had no idea how close she had come to losing everything. That night, as snow began to fall again over Denver, Lucas stood at the window, the city lights shimmering faintly below. Behind him, Sophie had fallen asleep against Rocky, her hands still tangled in his fur. He knew the fight ahead would be brutal against Monica, against Dylan, against a system that didn't always protect the innocent. But as he watched the fragile rise and fall of Sophie's chest, he swore silently that he would not let her slip into the cracks. For the first time in years, Lucas felt his purpose sharpen into something more than duty. It was personal now. The shadows had shown themselves, and he was ready to face them. The snow in Denver had thinned overnight, leaving dirty slush along the curbs and icy patches that glittered under the pale morning sun. Lucas Bennett left his loft bundled in a heavy navy coat, Rocky trotting at his side, his canine harness snug across his muscular shoulders. The dog's amber eyes scanned every corner with restless energy, as though he too understood that danger had moved closer. Inside, Sophie remained with Eleanor, her crayons scattered across the coffee table, each drawing more hopeful than the last. Lucas couldn't ignore the tremor of unease in her voice when she whispered before bed, "They'll come for me." He had promised her they wouldn't. Now, he had to make good on that promise. Marcus Hale had been up most of the night chasing leads, and when Lucas arrived at his office on the 2nd floor of an old brick building off Larimer Street, he found him hunched over a cluttered desk. The place smelled of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke that clung to the faded curtains. Marcus, wiry as ever, wore a crumpled brown trench coat over his shirt and tie. His pale blue eyes gleamed behind tired lids as he gestured Lucas inside. "I dug deeper," Marcus began, flipping through police files he'd pried loose. "Grace Reed's crash wasn't just suspicious, it stinks of orchestration. No skid marks, second vehicle unreported, And here, he shoved a grainy traffic camera photo forward. It showed a dark sedan slipping out of the tunnel seconds after Grace's car hit the barrier. Marcus tapped the corner. That bumper's got fresh primer. Guess who owns a sedan with that exact color mismatch? Lucas's jaw tightened. Dylan Cross. Marcus nodded grimly. But he's not the brains. Monica's name shows up in every financial record I checked. She filed for temporary guardianship the day after the crash, had paperwork ready as though she knew it was coming. And she's been pawning off Grace's belongings, jewelry, even piano books. You don't sell a sister's things while she's in a coma unless you're planning for permanence. Before Lucas could reply, a knock rattled the office door. Standing outside was a woman in her 40s, bundled in a gray wool coat and scarf, a clipboard hugged to her chest. She introduced herself as Clara Martinez, a CPS caseworker. Clara was average height with short curly brown hair streaked with gray, glasses perched on her nose, and a calm, steady demeanor. Life had made her practical, and her years dealing with fractured families showed in the quiet strength of her voice. "Detective Bennett?" she asked, eyes flicking briefly to Rocky. "We received a report about a child in your care, a girl named Sophie Turner. I need to confirm her safety." Lucas exchanged a glance with Marcus. CPS already. He had known this day would come, but it still felt too soon. "She's safe," he said firmly. "Safer than she's been in a long time. But you need to understand her aunt is part of the problem." Clara pursed her lips, her gaze unwavering. "That may be true, but procedures must be followed. If you're telling me there's abuse, I'll document it. Just know the court decides placement, not me." Lucas clenched his jaw, then nodded. "Come with me." Back at the loft, Sophie sat cross-legged with Rocky pressed against her side, coloring another drawing. When Clara entered, Sophie froze, clutching the paper as though it were a shield. Rocky bristled instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest until Lucas placed a firm hand on his neck. "Easy, boy." Clara knelt, keeping her voice soft. "Hello, Sophie. My name's Clara. I'm here to make sure you're all right." Sophie's big brown eyes darted to Lucas before whispering, "Don't let them take me." The plea pierced him like a blade. Lucas crouched beside her, his broad frame shielding hers. "No one's taking you," he said firmly. Clara, to her credit, didn't push. Instead, she glanced at the sketch Sophie held. It showed three figures again: Lucas, Rocky, and Sophie, standing beside a hospital bed where a woman lay smiling. Clara's throat tightened. She adjusted her glasses, scribbling notes quickly but silently. That evening, Lucas and Marcus followed a lead to a pawn shop on 17th Avenue. The place was dingy, neon lights flickering above barred windows. Inside, Monica Turner stood at the counter, her long dark hair styled sleekly, her coat unbuttoned just enough to suggest confidence. At 29, she was striking, with sharp cheekbones and a coldness in her dark eyes. Monica was the type who had once thrived on charm, but had learned manipulation was more profitable. She slid a silver bracelet across the glass, her fingers twitching with impatience. Next to her loomed Dylan Cross, broad-shouldered with a shaved head and a scar cutting across his jaw. At 28, Dylan looked like trouble carved into flesh tattoos peeking from under his leather jacket, fists calloused from fights. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed fear was his currency. Lucas and Marcus lingered outside in the shadows, Rocky stiff at Lucas's side, hackles raised. Through the cracked door, they caught fragments of conversation. "Once Grace is gone," Monica whispered sharply, "the paperwork's solid." "Fiona becomes mine. No more questions," Dylan chuckled low. "And with her, the checks keep rolling. Kids are gold mines, babe. Government loves handing out sympathy money." The words curdled Lucas's stomach. He shifted, instinct demanding he step in, but Marcus placed a firm hand on his arm. "Not yet. We need them to hang themselves with their own rope." He discreetly tapped the recorder hidden in his pocket. When Monica and Dylan left the pawn shop, Rocky let out a sharp bark that echoed through the cold street. Dylan's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing on Lucas's silhouette. For a tense moment, their gazes locked across the slush-covered sidewalk. Dylan smirked, lifting two fingers in a mock salute before tugging Monica toward their car. Back at the loft, Sophie waited nervously. Clara had left earlier, assuring Lucas she'd recommend Sophie remain in his care under temporary supervision. Yet the weight of Monica's and Dylan's conspiracy pressed heavier now. Lucas sat at the kitchen table, Marcus replaying the recording, Monica's voice echoing in damning clarity. Sophie padded over in oversized pajamas, Rocky at her heel. She climbed onto Lucas's lap, small arms wrapping around his neck. "You won't let them hurt me, right?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Lucas tightened his hold, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and resolve. "Not while I'm breathing." For a long moment, the room was silent, but for the crackle of the fireplace and Rocky's steady breathing. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the city in fragile white, as though trying to soften the darkness lurking beneath. Denver's skyline looked gray and washed out under the winter sky, the streets slick with melting snow and slush. Lucas Bennett drove his old SUV through the mess, Rocky seated upright in the back, alert as ever. The dog's head nearly brushed the roof, his pointed ears twitching at every sound, his amber eyes sharp as if he expected trouble around every corner. And in truth, so did Lucas. After what Marcus's recording had revealed, it was only a matter of time before Monica and Dylan tried to retaliate. That time came sooner than he expected. The lobby of Lucas's apartment building was crowded when he returned home with groceries that afternoon. A camera light glared in his face the moment the glass doors slid open. Monica Turner stood at the center of it all, her sharp features painted with exaggerated sorrow. Dressed in a sleek black coat and clutching a tissue to her cheek, she was live streaming on her phone. Her voice carried high and sharp, practiced for an audience. "They stole my niece," she cried. "A billionaire cop took her from her only family. My sister lies in a coma and they're using Sophie as some twisted charity case." Around her, bystanders paused, phones raised, some whispering, others recording. Dylan Cross leaned lazily against a pillar in the lobby, his leather jacket open, tattoos snaking up his neck. He smirked when he spotted Lucas, his scarred jaw catching the light like a badge of violence. His eyes were flat, daring Lucas to react. Rocky growled low, his hackles rising. Lucas tightened his grip on the leash, his hazel eyes narrowing as he forced calm into his voice. "Go home, Monica." "This isn't the place," but Monica only raised her phone higher. "Do you hear that? He thinks he can order me around. My niece is trapped upstairs with strangers while I, her blood relative, am left outside in the cold." Lucas didn't answer. Every word he gave her was another weapon for her performance. Instead, he moved past, shielding Rocky between him and Dylan, ignoring the stream of insults hurled at his back. But inside, anger twisted like barbed wire. She was poisoning the narrative before it even reached a courtroom. Later that evening, Marcus sat at Lucas's table, replaying the recording they had captured at the pawn shop. Monica's venom and Dylan's arrogance filled the loft, the sound undeniable. Sophie, sitting cross-legged on the couch in pajamas, covered her ears when Dylan's voice echoed. Rocky pressed closer to her, his warm body a wall of comfort. "We need more than audio," Marcus muttered, scribbling notes in his battered notebook. "Courts like paper. Reports, witnesses. CPS won't move fast without official law enforcement backing." As if summoned, the doorbell rang. Standing there was Officer Daniel Carter, a 34-year-old patrol officer with broad shoulders and short brown hair streaked with silver at the temples. His hazel eyes were steady but tired, and he carried himself with the weight of someone who had seen too much neglect to trust easy stories. His winter police jacket still carried flecks of snow. "Bennett," Carter said, his voice even but cautious. "We got a complaint filed. Allegations that you're holding Sophie Turner unlawfully." Lucas's chest tightened. "You've seen the bruises. You've read the reports. You know what she's been through." Carter's jaw flexed. "Doesn't matter what I know. I'm here to make sure everything's documented properly. CPS will file for an emergency hearing. Until then, she stays put, supervised." His eyes flicked to Rocky, who sat upright, tail stiff, reading Carter with uncanny precision. "That dog looks like he'd tear the throat out of anyone who came near her." "He would," Lucas admitted, "but only if they meant harm." Carter didn't argue. Instead, he scribbled notes into his field book, his voice quieter now. "Between us, Bennett, keep your evidence clean. These people are cunning. They'll twist anything. Don't give them ammo." 2 days later, the courthouse loomed, its marble steps slick with ice, wreaths of pine and faded red bows hanging in the windows. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. The family courtroom was a box of tension, wood-paneled walls rising high above rows of stiff benches. At the front sat Judge Rebecca Halpern, a woman of 58 with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun. Her black robe draped heavily around her dignified frame, and her sharp gray eyes cut across the room with authority honed by decades on the bench. Known for her intolerance of theatrics, she carried herself with a cool presence that silenced even the boldest attorneys. Monica entered first, dressed in mourning black, her pearl necklace gleaming against her throat. She clutched Sophie's worn backpack in her manicured hands as though it were proof of ownership. Beside her, Dylan slouched with arrogant indifference, his leather jacket squeaking as he sat, smirk plastered across his scarred face. Across the aisle, Lucas sat straight-backed, his uniform crisp, Rocky lying at his feet like a shadow. Sophie leaned against his arm, her tiny fingers tangled in his sleeve, her eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. Marcus sat behind them, notebook ready, while Clara Martinez, the CPS caseworker, arranged her files neatly, her calm face betraying nothing. The hearing began with Monica's attorney painting Lucas as a manipulative opportunist, using Sophie to fill a void left by his own past. Monica dabbed her eyes theatrically, gasping at rehearsed moments. Dylan smirked through it all. But then Clara stood, her voice calm and steady. She presented photos of Sophie's bruises, medical notes documenting neglect, and copies of Monica's pawn slips. The courtroom shifted. Judge Halpern's eyes narrowed. Finally, Marcus produced the recording. The grainy audio filled the chamber, Monica's whisper about custody being ironclad once Grace is gone, Dylan's chuckle about kids being gold mines. Gasps rippled through the benches. Monica's mask cracked, her jaw tightening as whispers rose. Dylan muttered something under his breath, only to be silenced by Officer Carter's glare from the back. Judge Halpern leaned forward, her voice low but cutting. This court takes allegations of neglect and conspiracy very seriously. Ms. Turner, you will refrain from contact with Sophie until a full investigation is complete. Temporary custody remains with CPS. Physical placement with Officer Bennett under supervision. Her gavel struck like thunder. Sophie's small hand squeezed Lucas's arm, relief flickering in her eyes for the first time in days. Monica shot him a venomous look. Dylan's smirk faltered, and for once the law stood as a shield instead of a wall. That night, back at the loft, Lucas built a fire in the hearth while Sophie and Rocky curled on the rug, the dog's head resting in her lap. For the first time since Grace's accident, the air felt less suffocating. The fight wasn't over, but Lucas knew one thing with certainty. The battle lines had been drawn, and he wasn't fighting alone. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive in blinding flashes of light, but in the quiet courage of ordinary people who choose to protect the innocent. Lucas, Sophie, and Rocky remind us that God's hand often works through the hearts of those willing to step forward, even when the world seems against them. In every act of compassion, every vow to keep a child safe, we witness a reflection of divine love. And in our daily lives, we too are called to be guardians of hope. It may be in listening to someone who feels unseen, helping a neighbor, or standing firm against injustice. Miracles still happen, often in small ways, when we choose love over fear. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment, subscribe for more stories of faith and resilience, and join us in prayer. May God bless and protect everyone watching this video. Type Amen in the comments if you believe miracles still walk among us.